Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Undetermined States of America podcast. This is the second podcast that we've done, and I'm honored and excited to have my guest, Nick Coccoma, join us today. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Colin. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So, Nick, you are the founder and executive director of the recently launched nonprofit Assemble America. And yeah, I was hoping maybe you could give a little background on just who you are, where you're coming in from, and what inspired you to start Assemble America.
Absolutely, and thanks for again having me on here. I think it's a bit of a story, so if you'll indulge, this opening answer might be a little
Please.
long, but yes, I as you said, the founder of Assemble America, and it's a new nonprofit with the mission to make democracy real by putting power in the hands of citizens' assemblies. Those are bodies of people picked by lottery, giving people creating a real government of, by, and for the people. And how did I find myself where I'm at? It's a bit of a journey. I'll start at the beginning because I think my childhood does play a role in maybe planting the seed for what I ended up doing. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York. It's got a big reputation, though, Cooperstown, which baseball fans out there might know. And it was a great place to grow up, a small town community, and my I grew up in a legal household. My parents were both lawyers. My father was actually a judge, and so growing up, if you wanted to go see my father at work or my mother at work, it meant going to trials to see a jury trials in process. So I probably grew up seeing more jury trials than your average American kid, and I think that you know that exposed me to probably the purest element of our purest democratic element that's in our form of government, which is the jury. And if you think about juries, it's really the real manifestation of the idea of the people having power. Here in this situation, we have everyday people come together, a cross section of the community. It's supposed to be, a jury of your peers. So it's supposed to be somewhat, you're supposed to be tried by people who kind of look, think, talk like yourself from your community, and they are sovereign in that setting. A jury is really in the moment the manifestation of we the people. And when the jury comes into the room, everyone stands up for the jury, even the judge, and that's a sign of the fundamental power and sovereignty of the people in that situations. So I saw a lot of this growing up, and my father in upstate New York, he actually run for judge. So when I was 10, he ran for the job, and I got to go canvass with him around the county and go to every small, church supper and chicken barbecue you could think of. And election day, there's always this ritual in Cooperstown where after you vote, you go down to the VFW hall for a pancake breakfast, and there was sort of this ritual celebratory atmosphere to election day and to the whole process. We marched in these parades and so forth. So that gave me also a sense of democracy as this kind of way of life, and as sort of having this ritual quality to it that knits the whole community together. And that is something that we all have to do. It was a town where there's one institution for every kind of sphere of life. There's one hospital. There's one gym. There was one, courthouse. There was one main street with a few businesses, and so in order for one school, versus one school was a public school, and so that did two things. First, it had a way of democratizing the population because everyone was thrown into these institutions together, whether you were from a privileged family or a poor family or the middle class in between. We all were together at the school. We all went to the hospital, got the same health care, and that meant everyone had to make sure, all the adults, that these institutions worked pretty well. And there was it motivated and created a positive incentive for the adults running the town to really invest in these institutions because we all had to benefit from them. And so there wasn't a lot of polarization or partisanship in that part of of the country growing up. Maybe more now, I don't know, but certainly back then there was less so. My family were kind of your typical, traditional Republicans. Um, like probably like George Bush voting Republicans, kind of very much rule of law was important. But their best friends were Democrats who were heavily involved in the Democratic Party, and so that party affiliation didn't matter too much. There weren't a lot of issues up
What
there.
year
That
was
really,
this?
this is I grew up in the '90s. Really was when this is 1994 was when my dad ran for judge and took office in '95. So between these, the seeing electoral politics in a small town, rural community, and then observing jury trials in action, I kind of took all this in at a very impressionable age. I thought about going to politics when I was in high school, and when I went off to college in Massachusetts, I thought about studying political science. But I came to the view that at some point in my teenage years that politicians and politics, there was this other side to it, which was the corruption and the kind of the sleaziness and the way you kind of can lose your soul in the process. And so seeing that kind of aspect to it all, the kind of sausage being made and everything, that began to repel me more and more. And then when I got to college, I basically fell into the theater world and became a theater kid, an arts kid, and ended up pursuing that as my course of study, and then went on to work mostly in the field of education. I've worked mostly as a teacher, as a chaplain. I studied theology as well, so I've worked as a campus minister at the high school and college level, and then also pursued freelance writing on various topics, mostly related to culture, religion, and politics, and so that was my young adulthood then took me in this kind of these other fields in the humanistic sphere, but not directly related to politics. So I was headed off in that direction when this little thing happened in 2016 that we all lived through, the 2016 presidential election, and like a lot of people, I was alarmed by what I was seeing developing, what came about over the course of the election, namely that I thought that there were certain norms and boundaries that we all agreed as Americans not to cross over, and I saw them being violated in ways that I'd never seen before certainly in my life, and so I was really awakened by this phenomenon, and I decided, I wanted to try to get involved in democracy reform efforts, and also to try to understand what was happening in the country.
Would you mind just quickly sharing some of the things that you kind of took for hard, given things that Americans wouldn't cross that were crossed?
Sure. I mean, the idea of not obeying the results of an election, and having a whole movement being okay with that. Constitutional norm saying we should, pursue entertaining the idea of that, and then the endorsement of political violence as a legitimation of that. Those sorts of things. I think especially the idea of not obeying an election, the results of the will of the people. That was like when I felt like we were really heading into some uncharted terrain.
So this is more in maybe 2020 than 2016, would you say?
I began in 2016 because even then,
Okay.
I think we're talking about Donald Trump here. Trump was asked, would he abide by the outcome of the 2016 election, and even then he said something like, "I'll think about it," or "We'll see." And the fact that was not immediately like disqualifying was shocking to me, to be honest. And again, coming from a traditionally conservative household, I mean, by this point, I was no longer identifying personally as a conservative. I was identifying more as a liberal, and but still, I mean that's a more progressive liberal. But conservatives are also supposed to be in favor of liberal ideas like the outcome of an election. But this points to the deeper assumption that I had at the time, which was that we have a democracy that's being undermined and that Americans are walking away from and are abandoning. So we had a democracy that we're in danger of losing, and the pillars of a democracy are elections and parties, political parties, the two foundations that we're all told and taught and are raised to believe and are told over and over again in schools and everything, but also by scholars that this is the core of what makes a democracy: robust political parties and free and fair elections. I mean, you can even see this definition in the United Nations, some of their charters on human rights and so forth, defining democracy that way. And so when I saw those pillars being attacked, I thought, okay, we're losing our democracy, and I want to try to get involved in some efforts to try to save it. What I came to learn in the course of my my efforts to find a way to help was that, in fact, I was wrong. It's not that we have a democracy that we're losing. It's that we actually don't have a democracy, and because of that, that's causing the problems, the very underlying social problems that are causing this kind of populist movement to come about, to throw their support behind the option of strongman rule. And so that was the great revelation, the great epiphany for me in the course of what happened next. And I can speak to what exactly I mean by that. But that was what I came to realize, and that revelation led me to where I am today. And so what do I mean? Maybe I'll just get into that. In the course of looking for reform efforts, I entertain various options, and there are a number of them out there. You see people advocating for all kinds of things, like campaign finance reform, having open primaries, voting rights protections, on and on. You can go down the list. And these are all, I think, positive things. They would certainly help improve the system. But every time I would think about those proposed reforms, I thought, this is kind of tinkering around the edge of the problem. It doesn't really get to the core. Mm-hmm. Is there something out there that really gets to the root of this all? And that's when I discovered through actually a TED Talk by a man named Brett Hennig, the use and the recent growth of a process called citizens' assemblies. And basically what a citizens' assembly is it's jury democracy. It's what I experienced as a kid seeing my dad at work, but applied to things beyond criminal and civil justice. What is a citizen assembly? It's basically got three main pillars to it. First, you select everyday people from all walks of life through a lottery to come together to form this assembly. So random selection of delegates to this assembly, a process that's technically known as sortition. Sortition is random selection of representatives. So that's number one, lotteries to pick everyday people to come together to form, again, a cross-section of the community, a representative sample of the population, a group that kind of mirrors descriptively what the population looks like of a community. The second pillar is they come together and then they learn about some issue or topic that they're going to be addressing. So they hear from a range of experts from across different viewpoints, along with stakeholders in the community, activists, civic groups, sometimes religious bodies, different groups that have something to say on this topic, to give this assembly, which is impartial, supposed to come in with open and with an open mind and impartial to as great extent as they can, to give them a full range of the issue. And then the third part after this intense learning phase is deliberation towards rough consensus. And deliberation is, again, we're familiar with this from jury service. It's 12 angry men going into the jury room, and the idea of deliberation is it's a specific form of human interaction. It's not the same as negotiation. It's not debate. It's not even really dialogue, although there's elements of dialogue. The idea is that the only thing that should hold sway in the course of the discussions is what's called the unforced force of the argument, meaning that you're trying to persuade people through rational argumentation, as well as emotional power. I mean, human beings aren't just purely rational; we're a mix of reason and emotion. So, the whole person is there. We all come with a kind of a deep history and a past, kind of a story that informs, often an emotional story that informs then our reasoning, our perspective. We're not completely unbiased, and that's important. That's another element of what's going on in deliberations among a diverse group of people, is that the diversity of the body, the cognitive diversity, can help people point out biases in each other's thinking and overcome that collectively. So you're going to end up with, a solution or thinking that's greater than the sum of the individual people, the wisdom of crowds, basically. So that's what deliberation is all about, trying to just use argumentation and empathy to come towards a rough consensus. A total consensus is impossible, but you're trying to achieve 75-80% agreement on what the policy should be about this issue that you've heard about, while at the same time allowing the minority view in the group to be expressed through in writing, through a report, kind of like a Supreme Court decision. What comes out of these assemblies is a majority set of recommendations on the policy, and then also, if there's a minority view, that gets represented through some kind of additional writing, and those are the three key pillars of a citizens' assembly: this random selection, the learning phase, and the deliberation toward consensus. And as I heard Hennig talk about this, I realized, this is, again, jury democracy. This is what I saw growing up. Because what is jury duty about? You randomly select jurors. They come together, they learn about the case, and then they deliberate towards consensus. So that was a revelation to me of something that, yes, that could get to the core root of so many of our problems. And what was even more mind-blowing to me, though, was when he told his audience, and I heard in the course of his talk, that this form of democracy, the use of sortition, actually goes all the way back to ancient Greece and informed the basis of Athenian democracy, and in fact was considered to be the form of a democratic regime through the ancient world up into the early modern period of Western civilization. That's where I really kind of fell off my chair when I came to realize, but to hear this idea that actually through most of Western history, democracy was linked to sortition, whereas elections, according to Hennig, were considered to be oligarchic or aristocratic fundamentally. If you want an oligarchy, if you want rule by a tiny few wealthy people, you use elections. If you want real democracy, power in the hands of the people, you use lottery. And that was the true kind of moment of coming out of the matrix, so to speak. And so what's happened in the years since is that I've continued my journey to first educate myself and investigate more. Is what he was saying true? And it turns out, yes, it is true. Democracy was always associated with the use of sortition up until really the advent of the United States after our revolution, as well as the Republic of France. And then I continued to learn more about now the modern rebirth of this form of democracy with citizens' assemblies, how they work, the theory and practice of them. And that set me on a course of getting involved with various activist groups and others in the field of what's called deliberative democracy. and has led to now my present work with Assemble America, which has a particular role to play that I can get into. But that's in a bigger nutshell than I intended. The long and the short of how I got here.
It's a very nutritious nut and shell. So thank you for sharing it. Yeah, thanks for sharing how you came to this work, Nick. And I'm no legal historian, and I don't want to put you on the spot because I don't know if you would know this, but do you know how juries came about as being such a central part of our legal systems? It's okay if you don't. I'm just curious if you know off the top of your head.
I know generally, and I have read about it, and I wish I could grasp the details, but it has a long history going back to, I believe, medieval times, actually in France and in England. Um, and it's a fascinating history of the development of the jury. But it really took off in England, and then in the colonial period, here in North America, in the British colonies, the juries were something that, the British system of rule was very not democratic, obviously with monarchy, but even parliament, and but the juries were this very democratic element that had come about over centuries. Really, it was a long process. But by the time they got here to the colonies, they were highly prized and kind of sacrosanct for the colonists. And in fact, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, one of the abuses that George III is accused of violating is the jury process, and that's one of the key, along with violations of due process and so forth, the key crimes that he's accused of that warrants a revolution in the eyes of the author. So it's a fascinating history, and I would certainly encourage people to look into how the jury came about. But it is the one element of democracy that did make the kind of survived and got to modern republics today, especially in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Because an interesting way I've heard the design of our current government being decided, and I don't know the specifics or like the exact history of it, but we have a kind of mixed constitution. Like you have the Senate, the House of the Representatives, the Supreme Court, and then the executive branch. And a rough idea I've heard conveyed before is that like the Senate is kind of meant to represent like the aristoi, like the aristocracy, because there's only two per state. The House of Representatives is meant to represent the kind of the people. There's way more of them per state, relative to the size of the state. And then the Supreme Court is like the kind of philosopher kings who are supposed to be removed from the day-to-day and have like lifetime appointments. And then the executive branch is meant to kind of, maybe more literally today, be like the king. And the reason I'm sharing, have you heard that way of describing how our Constitution is? Yeah, our government's set up.
A kind of mixed constitution. Yeah.
Yeah, mixed constitution. And so, and as you shared, we kind of, like I grew up also in upstate New York, central New York, Syracuse, and I think most Americans are educated that elections and democracy, those are synonyms, and they're so tightly wound into our psyches. And the reason I shared the mixed constitution idea is that, yeah, it sounds like it goes a lot further back, but if there was some kind of inspiration behind including juries in our legal procedures, because just to like this platform, Undetermined States of America, one of the premises is the idea that America is not really tied to like an ethnic identity. I don't think it's supposed to. We're tied to like a vision and an ideal of democracy, stated mostly in the Declaration of Independence and parts of our Constitution. And I like how you, in your story, you kind of shared like growing up in these like trials with your parents and feeling the kind of importance of the jury system, because I think part of what our identity is as Americans, when especially feels like kind of this transitionary, dare I even say, like adolescent time, is like, well, we're kind of meant to be pioneers and visionaries of democracy. I think that's one of the unique contributions of America to the like world, is like, look, we were able to kind of invent a kind of state 250 years ago almost. So that all is to say, here's my long-winded nut, perhaps, is that like I like how you're kind of thinking like, okay, what parts of what we currently have smacks most of that air of democracy and buy-in for the people. And so, yeah, I just would encourage, I guess, like listeners and people in general to like think of democracy much more pliably and creatively, because I think this synonyms of elections and democracy is like hurting us. And yeah, maybe you can speak more on that if you're open to it. And also, you mentioned the word republic, because I that's a common retort we usually hear people say, like, well, we're not a democracy. Like, well, that's because we're a republic. Do you maybe want to speak
Yes.
on what that means? And yeah, anything else I shared?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so it's another story of, okay, if what I'm saying is true, that democracy is non-elections, how is it that we're in this era that where we all are believe that they are? So there's the story of this goes all the way back to the classical period. I mentioned ancient Athens, and it's important to talk about ancient Athens in the classical period because the founders of the American Republic, of course, were consciously trying to look to the classical period. They were neoclassicists in many ways when they came to found this republic. So it's important for us to learn about Athens, so then we can re-examine what the original founders of the American Republic, what they thought about the Athenian example and the Roman example, and what they thought they were doing back in the late 18th century. So, say, hop in our time machine here. Athens, democracy, there's no one birthplace of democracy. It was, and we don't know exactly when it began. It began in many, many places, probably you could say it even began you could say it's actually the default mode of human self-governance, that if people left to their own devices, will try to sort things out democratically. And that you can see this, anthropologists and others see this a lot in kind of hunter-gatherer communities, societies. They were not all uniform. There were some they were experimenting with different kinds of government, but many were had an egalitarian form of making decisions, and this carried through across the globe in different societies. You see usually in small scale local communities. So India, the Americas with indigenous peoples, etc. Basically every continent, they now are finding examples of democratic ways of governing that go back to kind of prehistoric times and carry on. And what happens
Well, so just
sure.
for our listeners, because the etymology of democracy, demos means by the people. Is that correct? Like, or like the demos is like the people.
So that brings us to Greece, because democracy is a Greek word, and so it literally means, well, it's a compound word. Demos means people, and kratia means power. So it's saying, so democracy is a regime where the power belongs to the people. And then there are these two other words that typify. The Greeks basically thought there were three paradigmatic kinds of regimes. You could have a democracy, which is what I just described. You could have a aristocracy ruled by the best. Aristoi means best, and then I'm trying to remember I guess a tyranny, but forgetting the kratia word. But the corollary would be a monarchy an autocracy. There we
Or
go. So
autocracy.
an autocracy is ruled by one person. So those are the three words that are kritia words about power. They tell you who has the power. So in an autocracy, one person has the power. Aristocracy, the small group of the best, quote, in air quotes, and then usually that's the wealthy, and then in a democracy it's the people, which presumes to be then basically everybody, but primarily the working people, because it's in contrast to those other two types of regimes. Then there are these related words, archy words. You have monarchy, which is rule. Archy comes again. These are compounds. So arche means ruler. So those words are telling us how many rulers are there. So an archon is literally a ruler. So a monarchy is there's one ruler, and that kind of corresponds to an autocracy, but it may be a more benign form. A oligarchy is the rule. There are a few rulers, and that kind of correlates to an aristocracy or a plutocracy, or there are variations on all of these. And then a demarchy is the rulers are the people, and that corresponds to democracy. So those are the three kind of typical regimes in the Greek understanding. So in ancient Athens, now we're going to go back there to starting the 6th century. They were ruled for a long time by a monarchy, but then they, for generations, had an aristocracy ruling over them. This polis in the called Ithaca, which Athens is like this little city with the surrounding environs, which was the coastal parts of the peninsula, then the mountainous regions, and so they had ruled by an aristocracy for many generations through this institution called the Areopagus, and that's where these landed patrician elites would come together, and they're the ones that exercised rule, and they did so through the use of elections, which gets to this other idea for the Greeks that there was each of these regimes had a particular mechanism for legitimizing the ruler. So in a monarchy, it's like succession, hereditary succession. You could have a tyrant come along who could just seize power. He could also be an autocrat. So that's the coup. Then would be the mechanism of his accession to power. But in a aristocracy or / oligarchy, what they used was elections. So elections were used by the aristocracy of Athens to maintain their power. So, what happened then was something that we may be familiar with today. This aristocracy is in charge for many, many generations. And what happened was ballooning social inequality. The rich kept getting richer, these patrician families, whereas the poor were getting poorer. And the social unrest that was developing caused a political crisis in the 6th century, where these elites decided we got to do something. We got to try to enact some reforms because the people are growing so restive, and there could be a revolution here. They tried to enact some reforms under this guy named Solon, which began to lay the foundations for the future democracy, but they didn't go far enough, and eventually a populist demagogue came about named Pisistratus, who rode the grievances of the masses who were disempowered and losing economic security to lead a coup that toppled the aristocracy, and he ruled as a tyrant for many decades. So aristocracy ruled by elections leads to economic inequality, which leads to populist demagogue, tyrant. Something that, may be familiar again to our listeners. So how did Athens get out of this? It's a long story, but through a combination of political assassination, civil war, foreign intervention, they eventually topple this tyranny. They throw off also the power of the aristocrats, and in 508 BC they instituted a democracy under this guy named Cleisthenes, who was backed by the people. And through Cleisthenes, the people brought about the democratic regime, and they did a few things. They created a new form of social organizing. They created these new artificial tribes where they put people. These are the free male citizens. They put them into these tribes randomly, but selecting a third of the members of the tribe from the three major geographic regions of Athens. So you had the coast, the mountains, and the city. They filled these tribes with one third of the men came from the coast, a third from the city, and a third from the mountains, and they were assigned to these randomly. That was to encourage social mixing to overcome the kind of siloing of social divisions along geographic lines. But then the other key thing they did was create a new council called the Council of 500, which was kind of this all-purpose. It had sort of executive, legislative, and judicial functions, and it was a council of 500 Athenians. And the key thing, the innovation here was they were picked by lottery. They were picked by sortition, and they also empowered the juries, these people's courts, to have political oversight over the leaders. They conducted political trials through these courts, and that was all based on jury selection, again, randomly through this large pool of jurors. They also assigned magistrates. They were picked by lot to the various. It was basically their civil service. It wasn't quite the way we think of it now, but they had over 700 magistracies, and 600 of them were picked by lottery to do all kinds of things. And they also combined that with short terms of office and a real strict term limits. So you could only serve in these offices usually once, maybe twice. So there's a lot of details. It's really fascinating. But the key idea to get across to the listeners is that the use of lotteries was the key mechanism that was introduced to bring about the democracy. They did away, not entirely with elections. They still use them in a small way to pick their generals. But to break the power of the aristocracy, the demos introduced sortition, the random selection of everyday people, and the taking turns of rule. The idea of ruling and being ruled in turn was the key pillar. And this is something that Aristotle observed. He lived under the democracy through the 5th and 4th centuries. It existed for almost 2 centuries. And Aristotle was a great typologist. He kind of created these typologies in all of his works. And we looked at politics. He's the one that kind of talked about these 3 different kinds of regimes. And he first said something like, he says in his book Politics, elections are oligarchic, sortition is democratic. He's very upfront about that. And then he ends up talking about what's the best kind of regime for different societies. His personal preference was kind of a mixed regime. He thought maybe, sprinkle a little monarchy here, a little aristocracy, and a little democracy, and that would keep. But that wasn't like a prescription for every society. He actually thought that big societies, large populations, are better suited with many rulers. So actually, democracy is better suited for a large, diverse population. But that was what he said. So fast forward, after the Athenian regime and the democracy ended, sortition carried on in different polities. It kind of had a rebirth in the early modern period. The Italian city-states, the Italian republics of Venice and Florence used sortition, and carried on in other small city-states from the Renaissance onward. And but by the middle to late 18th century, it's kind of fading from the scene a bit. It's still carrying on in the Swiss cantons and some other places. You have the jury service in England and so forth, but it's diminished form. But still, it's known. It's widely known by philosophers. So Montesquieu and Rousseau, the great Enlightenment philosophers, they echo what Aristotle says. They say elections are aristocratic and sortition is democratic. And now they themselves don't want a democracy, but they say if you want a democracy, this is what you should use sortition. So this brings us all the way to the founders here of the American Republic. The Revolution throws off monarchy, and it was very much agreed that we want to create a republic. So what's that what is a republic to your questions. So the classical period defined a republic as a polity, a city state that is not a monarchy. So it's kind of a negative definition. A republic means, what does it say to, when you hear a place is a republic, what should that tell you? It tells you at a minimum, it's not a monarchy. There's not a sole ruler. Well, then what is it? Is it an aristocracy or is it a democracy? Well, it could be either, actually. In the classical period, they thought a republic could be both an aristocratic regime or a democratic regime. And this carried through into the early modern period. A republic was considered either one. So you can have an aristocratic republic or a democratic republic. It can go either direction. So in the founding of the American Republic, basically you have a struggle in the founding period, the original founding period, between these two visions of what kind of republic should we have. Everyone agreed we shouldn't have a monarchy, although some people still had kind of a lingering desire for that. Like Alexander Hamilton was accused of having monarchical instincts, which we can get into. But there is this struggle between having power more in the hands of the people or the wealthy, the aristocracy. Early on, from 1776 to the mid 1780s, under the Articles of Confederation, the new independent states created these state governments that were, for the times, very democratic. They had larger chambers. They weren't using sortition; they were using elections. But as far as elections go, they were pushing more towards a democratic direction, and they were also passing legislation that was economic, basically populist in orientation. It was providing economic relief because they were controlled more by everyday people. And so they passed debtor relief laws and paper currency. They passed laws to make it easier to not pay your taxes if you were under kind of the onerous tax laws. So these states initially were more democratic because that was the spirit of the revolution, the spirit of 1776, and especially influenced by the writings of Thomas Paine. His common sense really galvanized the masses to fight, not just to overthrow the king, but to create a republic. What happens is that the
Sorry,
economic...
If I could just...
Sure.
Oh, sorry, Nick. I have a little delay, I think, but I might have cut out for a second. Would you mind elaborating on how these states were more democratic in the beginning? Like what gave them that characteristic?
Well, many of them had single chambers, which were larger and had large numbers of delegates relative to the population. So that allowed more, you didn't have the separation like we do now with this lower house being the more populous, having a larger representative group, being dominated by a upper house that's more selective and aristocratic. Most of them were single chambers. They allowed for recall elections. If the people didn't like what the representatives were doing, they could recall them from office pretty easily. They could also bind their delegates with explicit instructions of how to vote once they got to the legislature. So there was more direct connection between the people and their representatives, like to the point of, you have to vote this way on this issue. Things like that. In Pennsylvania, that's actually a really interesting case. They even did so far as to abolish the unitary executive. Under the original Constitution of Pennsylvania for 1776, they didn't have a governor. They had a Supreme Executive Council. So there was a plural executive of 12, I believe, and they were elected one person from each county of Pennsylvania, which is fascinating. Ben Franklin served at one point as one of these. So those are some of the elements that typified these state the structure of these initial state governments and their constitutions. And then they all, as I said, through this they were able to, you had more representation for like farmers and the working classes as a result. And then therefore they passed legislation, economic legislation that was, making it easier for debtors and the common people to have economic relief. This, though, angered the wealthy and the creditor class. And so when you get to the mid 1780s, you have the elites in America really worried about what's happening, and they named some of this economic populist legislation as part of the cause for their concern. And these are people like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and so forth. And so they called the Constitutional Convention of 1786 in part to do some things that were necessary, like creating a more empowered national government to deal with defense and uniform taxation and currency. But it was also at the same time to put a brake on this democratic upsurge, because these people, these elites, they did not believe in democracy. Actually, this is kind of the dirty secret of our founding. When you look at the Constitutional Convention, the debates in 1786, and the notes from those discussions, to a man, the 55 delegates denounced democracy in the most explicit and no uncertain terms. It's kind of shocking, actually, to read. I mean, Hamilton, they were talking about how this is one. Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts called democracy the worst of all possible political evils. I mean, they thought it was evil. And why did they think this? Why were they, they look back to ancient Athens. Actually, they thought that they knew about Athens and the Athenian democracy, and they had read some of the writings about it. But those writings were written by the Athenian elites, people like Plato and Thucydides, who were very against the democracy because they were part of the elite families back then who were disempowered by the democratic regime. Plato's family was a patrician family. He had a relative who actually helped temporarily overthrow the Athenian democracy in this coup. And so Plato gives a very negative portrayal of the democracy. He has his hero, Socrates, Socrates was killed by executed by the Athenian democracy, which is something you often hear about. It's a charge leveled against it. But basically, the vision, the image of the democracy painted by some of these writers was of mob rule. And that's what the founders of the American Republic thought. They thought, Athens was this volatile, unstable regime, constantly in chaos, and so they appealed. Where did they look for their inspiration? They looked to Rome. The Roman Republic was what they wanted to emulate. And if you look at the features of our state, the American state, it's all taken from Rome. The Senate, right? That's that was from Rome. Our eagle. The Romans had the eagle. Our motto, "E pluribus unum," is in Latin. There was this. Greek was not regarded highly by the elites of the day. Rome was. Sometimes to good effect. When Washington famously stepped down from power, he was consciously imitating the Roman hero Cincinnatus, who famously left his farm to go serve as consul, and then once he did his service, saved the Republic, he relinquished power to go back to his farm. So this civic virtue that Washington and others highly prized, was also came from Rome, and that was good. But they did not like Athens, and so they didn't like democracy. Now it's very convenient for them because they're the elites. So if you think an aristocracy is the best form of a republic, then and if you're in that class, then it was kind of a self-serving argument. So, but the way this cashes out is that the Constitution contains all these anti-democratic features to it. And the scholars are now very open about this today. We're living with the effects of that, and many people feel, that our Constitution has all these anti-democratic features. The Electoral College and each state gets the existence of a Senate, and the way that each state gets the same representation there. The Supreme Court is a very aristocratic, oligarchic element. Again, looking at it from the lens of this classical typology. And you could go on and on and on. Initially, there were all kinds of, voting rights were limited, of course, citizenship. There were even things, more anti-democratic elements that Madison and company wanted that they didn't get. Um, and and so people are we're more, I think, reckoning with this today. But the one thing that people are still catching up to is the fact that elections themselves are not democratic. Elections are the use of elections is part of the oligarchic structure of our form of government, and that's the legacy of the Constitution. So people talk about the Constitutional Convention as kind of a counter-revolutionary moment, pushing back against the democratic phase of the revolution, which charts with the course of many revolutions throughout history. There's sort of these phases, and you have an initial moderate phase, followed by a kind of more radical phase, and then often a counter-revolutionary phase. And then there comes about a kind of a synthesis often. And this leads to the next part of our story, which is, okay, we have the creation of this new government under the Constitution that's heavily aristocratic, and it's dominated in the first 10 years by the Federalist kind of clique, who were very, very aristocratic in orientation, and so, like John Adams, Hamilton. Some of them even entertain eventually going back to a monarchy, and they treated Washington as kind of a king. I mean, in the beginning, he was having audiences that were very ceremonial, like the King of England. He was dressed in this very ceremonial garb and stuff. And John Adams was very concerned about what title he should have when he was in the Senate as the vice president. The vice president's the president of the Senate. He was like, should I be addressed as, what should be my title? So the Federalists were kind of thinking we'll create a new aristocracy here in America. But then the backlash to that, the opposition led by Jefferson and then eventually Madison, kind of flips teams, begins to push back and revives the spirit of democracy, the spirit of the revolution. And Jefferson was not part of the Constitutional Convention. He comes back. He serves as Secretary of State in Washington's administration, and he becomes kind of really concerned by what Hamilton is trying to do and his colleagues, and he thinks that this is a betrayal of the Revolution and the Declaration. So he and Madison formed the first political party, which they give the name of the Democratic Republicans, which is kind of a tip-off for us today. They say we still want a republic, but we wanted the more democratic republic, and they start to try to push back against the Federalists. So what happened? That's why the election of 1800 is so critical, because this battle comes to a head. Are we going to be a more aristocratic republic or a more democratic one? And Jefferson wins, and it's considered as important as independence, really, in 1776. And his vision really wins out then and carries through in the 19th century of a more democratic America, still a republic. And that coincides with a cultural shift in the early 19th century, where you have suddenly Greece becomes the hot topic, and Greece becomes cool and hip in the eyes of the culture and the high society as well. And Rome falls down in estimation by teachers and scholars. So all of a sudden everyone wants to be like Greece, and Greece means democracy. And this coincides with the growth of the mass party system under Jackson, the Jacksonian era, which historians kind of associate with the real birth of American democracy, quote unquote. This is when you have de Tocqueville comes over from France, and he looks at America and he calls it, he names his book Democracy in America. So you have the spirit of democracy infusing the country, which culminates with Lincoln at Gettysburg saying, this is a government of, by, and for the people. And you can see abolition and emancipation as the culmination of this democratic movement to expand citizenship, expand who's considered part of the body politic. It's a democratic kind of movement. And that's, I think, and this will wrap up my historical story here. I mean, that's how we get to a situation where you start to have a regime based on elections being called a democracy. It's sort of this fluke of historical evolution, kind of an evolutionary mismatch, where we had a system, an architecture, kind of the hardware of our system at the Constitutional Convention is oligarchic, but the software being run on this by the people is what they're trying to do is create a democratic, regime inside of that. And you could look at American history as basically the ongoing struggle between these two visions of the republic. Should it be more democratic or more oligarchic? And they kind of gone in these kind of this ebb and flow. You can see the Gilded Age is kind of the oligarchic forces in ascendance. You can see the New Deal and the mid 20th century as the democratic movement again in ascendancy. You could say right now we're in the midst of a oligarchic backsliding that occurred starting in the 80s, 1980s. So it's this ongoing struggle. What kind of republic do we want to be? And I would say that we've made some extraordinary democratic achievements, but the problem is that the oligarchic forces always have an advantage because the Constitution is as I say, fundamentally not really democratic, and a system based on parties and elections really can't be. And I can get into why more details how elections aren't democratic and why parties are not, but that's kind of the historical story and how we got to this point now where we all think elections are democratic, but they're really not, and we got to, I think, reckon with that if we're going to bring about real democracy.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know that was a lot.
I asked about the history.
There you go.
Yeah. Moving on to our third bullet point. No, that was really helpful, and I appreciate that overview, Nick. I can tell you've read into this quite a bit, and well, I do want to start to get into where we currently are and what Assemble America does, and just so you know, there has been a little bit of a lag with your video. I'm not sure if you can switch Wi-Fi perhaps, and we can cut this part out.
Okay.
But the quality has gone down a little bit. I think it's going to record on your end anyways, so I think it'll be smooth when we put it all together.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just...
Political discourse are... We bring in words that come from different other culture. Other cultures are brought together. So republic is a Latin word. Res publica means thing of the people. So that comes from Rome. So the Greeks never said we are a republic because they were not speaking Latin. They were speaking Greek. And so they had, their word was polis, which meant city-state. And the polis was the people of that place. The polis was actually, it wasn't the land. City-state isn't actually a great translation because it implies that the actual physical place was the state, but actually they thought that the people were the state, but it meant the people in this place. So Athens was a polis, Sparta was a polis, etc. And so I think republic is more probably correlates a bit more towards polis, but the idea is it's a regime led by the people. But again, both the Greeks and the Romans thought that could mean either an enlightened aristocracy that exercises rule on behalf of the people, or the people themselves taking turns ruling and being ruled. And this gets to the heart of what happened in the late 18th century, where here in America and in France, the idea of liberalism, this is the age of the Enlightenment. And so the idea here is instead of being ruled by these monarchs who could be terrible people, but hey, what are you going to do? He could be an idiot, but he's the king. We're going to replace that with an enlightened rule by enlightened people, enlightened, usually the best, which is going to correlate with educated people who can have the time and the leisure to exercise governance, to steer the state towards the common good on behalf of the people. So we are serving the people. But we're exercising that rule on their behalf, and as opposed to the people themselves, because the founders' view of human nature was that that most people are unsuited for self-government. That people are too too vice-ridden and overwhelmed by passions, and they're ignorant, and most people are left to their own devices will do kind of bad things. They kind of had a negative view of human nature. But there are a few people among the masses that will be the best, and they will rise to the top. So we will have this natural aristocracy. That's what Jefferson and others thought they were creating. And so through this system, we'll all these things put in the Constitution were sort of gates to filter out more and more the will of the people, which could be swayed by demagogues and populist passions and ignorance, and to put filters on that so that only the most enlightened, best people could exercise rule. That's an aristocracy. And liberalism itself is premised on this with the idea of elections, because the idea of liberalism's basic political theory of political legitimacy is that the theory of consent of the governed, that the people are sovereign, yes, so it's not the king, but they consent to be governed by others. They actually, so we start out sort of in a state of self-rule, but we outsource that to others. That's what consent means. I consent for someone else to govern over me. And as long as you have my consent, you can do whatever you want. But you may exercise, in other words, you can do whatever you want once I consent for you to govern me. You may do things that I don't actually like in the actuality, but that's sort of like that's not relevant, because once I consent for you to go do the governing, I don't have any real say anymore. And why does this matter? Because elections are, in the liberal political theory, elections are the kind of ritual enactment of this outsourcing of our power to others, of our consenting to be governed. And so that's what an election is, where we elevate an elite class of political rulers to exercise rule on our behalf. Now, they're supposed to do that because we're a republic. They're supposed to rule in a way that benefits the people. But that kind of gives them a huge license to rule in any way they see fit. And we may say, hey, actually, we don't like what you're doing. And they can say to us, oh, you don't, yeah, I know you don't like it, but, trust us, this is for your good, which is kind of the attitude of, like, especially the Supreme Court. Actually, John Roberts himself has said words to that effect. We're enlightened and you are not. So, yeah, you may not like this, but, what do you know? And this really, that's the core of liberalism and elections. And actually, the word, talking about etymology, the word election and elite are etymologically linked. You can hear it in those two words. Elite, elect, this idea of elevating. Actually, God, and it goes, the word there's this idea of someone, a lord above you. And elections also have roots in medieval, in the medieval system, electing lords, and even in the church in some areas. It goes back to pre-liberal roots there. So that's sort of the dirty secrets and the dirty history of elections and republics, and so So elections, then, in an election we surrender our power to others to govern. Whereas a democracy is premised on this idea of taking turns ruling. The people rule and are ruled in turn. And that's what sortition allows for. The random selection, the rotation of office holders. We're not creating a separate political class. We're maintaining our own self-governance. Similarly, parties are not democratic when you think about them. Again, we're all told, no, a party is a mass political organization. That must mean it's democratic. But no, they're not. Why? Because a party is all about creating a system. It's like a boss system. It's a system of bosses. It's like, you think about them over history, even in the U.S., like we talk about, there are party bosses, right? And the head of the party is usually one person. He or she is the top boss. And then there are these sort of captains underneath him or her, the local party bosses, and it becomes a system of sort of patronage. And the bosses internally have to create party discipline, where everyone in the party has to toe the party line. That's not a very democratic attitude. And a democracy is supposed to be a boss-free regime. That's another definition I've read about. A regime where there are no bosses because the people are their own again, boss. There's a kind of collective. So again, there's this actual strong tension, and I would say opposition between a party system and a democracy. Democracy is supposed to be a regime where there are no formal, hardened parties in a structural sense that run things, just as they're not supposed to have elections, because the two combine together to create this elite set of rulers that often do things we don't like. And this is, I think, the struggle that Americans have today. Is we look at our government and we see all kinds of decisions being made by the government and other liberal republics too, the world over. The people are so frustrated and angry. It's like, you're making all these decisions we don't actually like. Like, the polling on this issue is, 70% of Americans want X, but the Congress doesn't do it. And we think that's a problem of corruption, and there is corruption. We think, well, we got to smooth this out so that the Congress does more what we want, reflects our will. But the truth is that actually the very liberalism and elections are premised fundamentally on the governors not having to do what the people always want in every situation. And the question, because they're supposed to be enlightened. So the question becomes then, do we actually believe that anymore? And I would say no. I think the opposite is true. We've learned now about human nature through social science and psychology that the founders' view of human nature was actually wrong. It's not the case that most people are venal and stupid and ignorant and can't govern themselves and are vice ridden, and a few people are the best and emerge out of this as sort of heroes. It's the opposite. It's actually psychology and social sciences have shown us now that most people, the vast majority of the population, are decent people. We're a decent species with hardwired for social cooperation. We're built with a lot of pro-social instincts. And again, left to our own devices, we'll work out ways to get along and make everyone, be treated as equals and kind of find ways to coexist and live together in harmony. Where does it go wrong? Well, now all the research has shown that we go wrong because there are few in a large population, the human species, there are these outliers, these personality types that are on the margins who exhibit a lot of antisocial behavior. And you hear this in the literature, the kind of dark triad of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, sociopathy. And it turns out those individuals, who are a very small number in the general population, are unfortunately very adept at getting positions of power. And then when they get into those positions of power, they use them in ways that are, self-aggrandizing and destructive, often, too often. Some studies I've read from Brian Klaus, the political writer, he cites research that argues that there are 25 times more psychopaths in government and in business leadership roles than in the general population. And some think that's actually a low number. So this is where human nature there's this mismatch again between how people actually are and the system of government that's been set up. It actually empowers these marginal people with antisocial tendencies to get into power. It's not saying that everyone who's a politician or in office or in leadership roles is sociopathic. No, you can find examples of good ones, but I think you look at government, legislatures and people in government, and the vast majority are kind of mediocre. I think we'd all agree. It's like, meh. And then you got often really bad ones, and then a few handful of exceptional people. But that's not, according to the founders, it's not supposed to be that. It's supposed to be the best rise to the top. So there's this huge mismatch then too between human nature and liberal republicanism that we got to reckon with.
Well said, and I agree. And maybe to play the devil's advocate, what might have led the founders to that view back then, besides them being kind of perhaps a bit elitist, which I definitely think played a role, is perhaps there was less public or widespread education I'm not advocating for this view. I think, well, here's why they did that, Nick. Because, yeah, I've been reading, as I mentioned in the last podcast episode, Autocracy by Alex Guerrero, which has been a great book, and he kind of referenced, like, I think it was Hayek, an economist, who was extolling the benefits of the free market in economic terms, which is that the mechanism of the free market most efficiently allocates value to the right pricing, because if someone finds something valuable and they want it, but someone else can create that thing, that's going to course correct for the actual legitimate price rather than some sort of centralized planning body. And how he, I mean, I'm just trying, how I think he drew the analogy in Autocracy is that, like, where do you get political wisdom from? Like, I kind of think of it like, okay, elections and sortition are different mechanisms for granting authority and political power. And then it becomes also a question, and I'm simplifying it here, of like, well, what do people actually do once they have that power, and how do they actually govern and think through things and decide on policies? And the analogy he drew with Hayek in this book, it was just like a chapter on it, was that political wisdom, and using your definition, Jared, like the polis of like the people, like wisdom about what should be done for other citizens as a citizen. He said, I forgot if he was cited an author for this, but he just shared in the book that is actually most likely stored in the citizenry, much like a free market unlocks the correct price to value for material goods and services. That political wisdom is actually probably, it could be seen as like stored in the loads of our fellow citizens' hearts and minds and experiences as being a diverse population, not just ethnically, but professionally and education-wise. So, yeah, because once if the sociopath, I mean, yeah, I agree, not all politicians are potentially sociopathic, and if that figure you stated is true, if 25% higher, I'm still assuming it's a pretty low percentage of the population that are sociopathic. So even if it's 25% higher, or 25 times, you say 25 times or percent? Do you know?
I believe it's
25x?
times. I believe it's 25
Okay.
times. Yeah.
Don't worry about that, folks. There's totally not too many. Yeah, like even, yeah, like are those people going to have the life experience and understanding of what is going to be best for 350 million people? And yeah, anyways, because once you get in the door of power, what I like about the word, so to change gears to like deliberative versus electoral democracy, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, like electoral democracy kind of, because we've all grown up as Americans, assuming, you know, our listeners are American, and if you're not, welcome. You're very welcome here as we figure this shit out in our country. Because Americans have been schooled and educated to like really highly value democracy. And to me, I see that as a huge cultural benefit for people like yourself and Assemble America taking initiative to kind of try to close the gap between our desire for democracy and how good that word feels on our lips, because it's been taught to us, part of our cultural heritage, if you will, and the fact that, well, actually, the dirty secret is we're not really democracy, and actually there was very explicit efforts to de-democratize our government. I still think democracy is so welded onto our hearts and our minds as like Americans, is important, something to go to. So I see that as like a huge cultural boon for this work you're doing. And the advantage of like when we add an adjective to electoral democracy versus deliberative democracy, it's opening up the space in Americans' minds to think, well, what makes a democracy or democratic? And as you've shared and we talked about now, it's like that so far has been elections. But then one way you could even get people to think more deeply about it is like, well, once you elect all these sociopaths to, or some of them to the office, like, what are they doing actually behind closed doors? Like, it's kind of like, well, what is actually like democratic process look like? And that's what I like about deliberative democracy. It's not just like you can arguably have an electoral democracy that leads to a deliberative democracy, because deliberation, and I'd like you to jump in here, is like kind of more what they do once they get in to power. As you said, three aspects: citizen assembly, random selection, the learning phase, and then deliberation. Because I'm guessing, and we've seen, I think most Americans don't think healthy deliberation is taking place behind closed doors, and sociopathic or not, and this is some of the arguments Alex Guerrero makes in his book, is that the world is vastly more complex than it was in 1787, and to even have a hope at meaningful deliberation now, you would need to be like a superhuman, or in the sortition deliberative space, like we need more people focusing on separate things rather than a generous legislator. Anyway, I just went on a little rant, but maybe you want to jump in on any of those points?
Well, you're touching on so many key issues with electoral systems, and a big one is the epistemic problem, the lack of knowledge for dealing with these highly complex problems we have in a highly complex society. And we're using an outdated model for dealing with that, if you want to look at it from the lens of knowledge and wisdom. So, the idea of liberalism is premised on the idea, as you said, that there's going to be a few. We want people who are educated, and we evaluate people for office on an individualistic basis, looking at which individual person here has the greatest number of talents and wisdom and knowledge and experience and to be the best, excel at this role. But that presumes that any one person could know, especially in a single all-purpose legislature that deals with every policy domain, that one person could have knowledge of these vastly complex problems. I mean, the very premise of it is laughable, actually, when you think about it for a moment. And then, of course, in practice, yes, the best do not get into power. It's often party apparatchiks, mediocrities who work the party system, party hacks, megalomaniacs who, and I mean, even if they weren't that, you look at the life experience, the background, like 80% of Congress, I think, are made up of lawyers or business people. I can tell you, coming from a legal family, I value and highly revere the legal profession. But any lawyer who's being honest would tell you, in a second, law school does not teach you about how to deal with all the social problems of the world. It teaches you about law. How is it that we're having these people? So then you think, okay, well, we need experts to get involved here, and if only the politicians could listen to the experts, but they don't. They don't listen to policy experts at all, and this comes from former politicians themselves. One of the people I admire a lot in this field is Terry Bericius, who's a former politician from Vermont, former colleague of Bernie Sanders, and he's written a lot about. He calls himself a recovering politician. And he's written a book that's coming out soon. I'll plug Terry's book called "The Trouble with Elections." And he says openly what we all observe, which is that inside the halls of legislatures, first of all, the people inside are just like us in terms of there's a few great people, a few exceptionally awful people, but then most kind of like meh. But then probably a higher percentage that's not really representative though of the people. Again, they're all wealthy, old, often male lawyers and business people. Does that reflect the vast population and all of our diversity? No. And then there's lack of cognitive diversity too. They all kind of think the same, and then they don't engage in real learning. He talks about what politicians are really adept at is public relations and negotiation. That's what they do. So they're thinking about PR and their image. if there's any policy knowledge, it resides in the staff. But often they're the last consulted, or what they advise in terms of voting is given less importance than how it's going to make me look in the next election. And so that's so much for for getting knowledge. But then when it gets to compromising and debate, deliberation, there's no deliberation that happens in legislatures and in Congress. What happens is negotiation, which is different. Negotiation, think about like a hostage standoff, right? That's a negotiations paradigm, kind of frame. What happens in that? It's like you take a hostage you put the gun. The terrorist has a gun to the hostage's head, and then it's a standoff between them and the security forces trying to save this hostage. And what is that about? It's about leveraging power. Who has more power in this situation than they can get an edge on the other, and extract from the opposition as many concessions as they can while giving away as few as possible to them. And often what they're trying to get out of that encounter is not what's in the best interest of the public. It's what the party wants. It's what special interest groups may want. It's the pork trading and the sausage making, swapping things for this for that, the horse trading. None of that is deliberation. That's all a perversion of what's supposed to go on. And we think that's a bug of the system, but that's really a feature. I mean, most scholars, political scientists will say, well, that's what it's supposed to be about. Politics is about marshaling your power base based on certain interest groups, and they come together and they square off, and it's a model based on conflict and basically war in the end is the fundamental premise of this. Versus deliberative democracy coming out of the jury model is based in a more true, healthy vision of human nature, which again is like idea that we all have certain self-interest, but we also have a universal drive to things in common, and we're hardwired to try to work not just to coexist, but to actually bridge our differences and come to something where we all feel good about the outcome, instead of like, well, I got some stuff out of this. I walked away from this negotiation with a little bit here, but I feel really bitter about what I gave away. So
bruised and bloodied and
right. And then again, to go back to the epistemic thing, it's like, well, people think this is where you get experts involved, but experts are also, we need expertise. God knows that's one way to overcome the epistemic problems that we're facing when dealing with social problems. But experts themselves also suffer from sort of cognitive biases. They often think in one way, and they're specialists. They go after one specific, they go deep into one area of knowledge. What we need to have, though, combined with that is a breadth and a kind of wide perspective, and also the wisdom that comes from everyday life experience. And that's why if you take a random sample of a large population, you bring them together, first they're going to reflect the actual makeup of the people in society and all their diversity, especially cognitive diversity. They're going to think differently in different ways, their minds. So, and then they're going to have this vast general experience from their life, from all kinds of fields. That's going to give you a much better basis for figuring out a problem. You then combine that with deep expertise from specialists. You get them together and get the assembly learning from these experts. That's going to be a recipe for a much more intelligent decision, because it's been shown that diverse groups of people, this is Helen Landamore's writing, diverse group of people will produce a more intelligent outcome than even a group of specialists thinking alone, because the specialists think their minds kind of don't have the same cognitive diversity. But the best is to bring them together, and that can help us deal with the complexities of society.
And just to qualify what you mean by best, or what Helene, is it Helene or Helen Landmore?
Helen Landamore, yeah. She's a scholar at
Yes.
Yale. Yeah, she's written a book called Open Democracy and also Democratic Reason, in which she marshals evidence that cognitive diversity of an assembled group of people will produce more intelligent decisions than a homogenous group of people, even if that group are experts in some kind of area.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering like what the criteria, because this is in the realm of like political decision making, which is arguably and sadly, a kind of decision making that only most Americans don't have much experience in unless they're on like the local school board or their homeowners association or something like that. It's probably something limited. So is that the probably limited experience? Because there's this idea, I forget what philosopher said it, maybe Aristotle, like phronesis, I think, like practical wisdom. Because obviously we would think that experts probably would make better technical, like techne, decisions about the things they are experts in. But those aren't, I guess, really decisions, but more like, elaborations and understandings. But this idea, just to qualify for our listeners, like, well, what do we mean here by better decisions are made by cognitively diverse groups? They're better in the sense that they are informed by a wisdom that is won through living life and being a human participating in civic society. Does that make sense? Or yeah, do you want to elaborate
Yeah,
on that? If I'm
yeah,
going up the right trail here.
no, you
Yeah,
are, and it's a complex, nuanced part of this, sort of subtopic in here, and
we are
uh,
getting into the we. I think
we're getting
yeah,
in the
this is
weeds, yeah.
interesting, but we are a little bit yeah.
But people, I mean, it's important. I mean, I was trying to persuade some people the other day about democracy by assembly, and they came back at me. Their argument was the problem with this country right now is that there's vast amounts of people who are ignorant and stupid and uneducated, and so that's really the issue. And so, you know, my question back was, what is your prescription for dealing with that? And you could say, well, we need better education, but you're not going to be able ever to devise the education system that is going to be able to deal with all the complex problems of the universe, of the planet, and because even people who go through the education system again aren't, we have highly educated people serving government, but they still aren't going to be able to figure out the problems of society because they can only know so much, and so you need cognitive diversity. Um, but the other problem with that line of thinking is, well, what is that? What are the implications of that politically? If you think only the intelligent should be in power, that's not democracy. That's a technocracy, which I think a lot of liberals, actually professional class liberals, kind of want right now, because we're in an age of
Yes.
this anti expertise moment here, and it's terrifying. I mean, I'm appalled by what's happening right now, the assault on science and knowledge and expertise. So this is not a brief for troglodyte forms of social, of a great leap backwards. Or I don't want to like kind of fetishize or sacralize, like elevate sort of the common person, the kind of common sense above expertise. That's not what I'm saying. But what we want to do is have a system where experts are on tap but not on top. They're there to they give all of
Mm.
their what they learn, but they don't have final say because that's not a democracy. That's a form of oligarchy. Still, it's kind of a technocracy, and that's not gonna work. That's not gonna People are not gonna be happy with that. The masses will eventually be they're gonna feel like I don't have power over my life. I'm ruled by this, and that's part of the appeal of the populist, right? But it's also just not going to produce intelligent outcomes because, again, the experts first often disagree about how to address social problems. These a lot of social problems are these quote unquote wicked problems. They don't lend themselves to kind of straightforward solutions, and the solutions proposed have a lot to do with the preconceptions of the particular expert addressing the issue, like poverty. It's like, and that often has to do with moral values that the expert is bringing to bear on the topic, which gets us to actually what's really going on in political decision making. Yes, you have to get informed and learn as much as you can about a topic. You don't want to have ignorance here. But in the end of the day, a lot of political decisions are really about moral questions, questions of values. How do we want to live together? What is a good society? What do you think is justice here? And and that's not something that you ever learn in school. I mean, you can learn about it, but the school of life teaches us a lot about that. And no, there cannot be an enlightened priestly caste that will give you the answers to those problems. We want to think that's the case,
Yeah.
but in the end, so everyday people are as capable of making moral judgments as anyone else, and and I would say that that's what politics is the end in the end is really about. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And democracy, yeah. Because it's kind of like you can maybe one kind of crude way to give a taxonomy of the differences between like a technocracy or plutocracy or oligarchy or is that because you could someone could make the case that well the reason I want an aristocracy is not because I hate the people or something, it's because that person subscribing that might have a bona fide belief that the most clearly articulated vision of the common good is going to come from that particular group in power, right? It's like
Hmm.
a technocracy, if we just have the experts like, well, we actually think that experts are likely to have the best vision for what the common good might be, but they all kind of, I mean, that's how I'm thinking of it in certain sense. They all one way they all differ is like where do we think the kind is the most likely to produce like a vision of like what the good what a good society is or the common good and yeah and like a democracy yeah it kind of is like well it's contained within the people and then I think the response someone could have to someone who says well people aren't educated enough and uh, they voted for X, Y, and Z, so therefore we shouldn't have a sortition based thing. Is well, when people are given the opportunity to sit down and learn about something, there's like empirical evidence, and you might know this if you could cite it, like that they will actually change their viewpoints on things. Like we often just when we poll people we're maybe calling them right after they just finished a 4 hour binge of Tucker Carlson. And we're like, what do you think about this? And then they
Right.
give you their kind of gut response. But if we kind of assume the good in people and like try to give them the benefit of the doubt and like give them the opportunity to actually like listen to different experts and to like take the time to form their thoughts, there's like evidence, I think, that they're going to have different, they'll reach conclusions that might not be expected no matter what their educational level is.
I couldn't agree more. You want a system that sets people up for success to make a good decision. Right now, and so this gets us to like, yeah, what are all the pathologies running through the electoral system? I mean, you look at them. First, they offer false choices. It gives people a limited choice between two competing teams of elites about who should govern, especially in a duopoly like ours. So that's not really much of a choice between everyone. We don't even get a chance to elect everyone.
Could
Anyone.
you elaborate on what a duopoly is or how you think where our system's currently that?
Oh, like a two-party system. In the end,
Okay,
the
yeah.
parties
Yeah.
produce the candidates, and we get boiled down to often just two individuals that we have a choice from. That's
Hmm.
and often they're just again two two elites from competing teams of elites. It's like sports, which do you like, the Red Sox or the Yankees? And that gets to the second problem with electoral system. It breeds toxic tribalism. Parties are designed to foment hatred of the other party. Politicians, they're one of the things they often do is, they're not incentivized to compromise with each other. They're incentivized to make the other side look stupid, evil, or untrustworthy, and that you should hate them. And we think, you know, tribalism and polarization is a problem right now. Well, no, it's like a bug of the system. No, it's a feature. Again, parties breed this. That's not a recipe for producing, healthy outcomes about a good society. Then you have all the corruption that goes on in a campaign, all the buying of elections and the money flooding into it, and then at the overarching all of this is the problem of what's called rational ignorance. You're asking people when they go to vote, they have very little influence on the ultimate decisions of government. Even your vote matters so little mostly of the time in such a huge population. And the issues are so vast and complex that we're being asked to deal with. But again, we're given this really narrow choice of two people often. And the voters are busy with their lives. There's a lot going on. Who has the time, the energy, the motivation to do all the research into everything that you would need to do to make a good decision with such a minimal impact you're going to have in the end? That it would take extraordinarily self-motivated person to do all that. And instead, actually the system sets up people to be ignorant. It's actually their ignorance. It's not just that there's a lot of skulls out there that's saying, oh, people should get more informed when they vote, or they should get better educated. Well, why? I mean, your vote has so little impact on the ultimate decisions that are made. It's actually pretty rational not to spend much time on it. And so instead of asking people to, to all of a sudden become geniuses, maybe we should change the way we're having them setting them up to make decisions. Now, people often say, well, maybe elections bring about greater accountability for politicians, but that's been proven not to be the case when, like, in every election, 90% of incumbents get reelected. And, politicians make many, many decisions. You could disagree with a lot of them, but at the end, you may forget what they did the first year of office after year 4, and then you're having to choose between them and this other party that is even worse. So, like, there's no accountability in elections. That doesn't really there can be a throw the bums out moment, but that's pretty rare. So that's the problem on the side of elections. All these pathologies, the tribalism, the corruption, and then this rational ignorance problem. And then you have, once politicians are in power inside the chambers, you have a bunch more pathologies, like, again, the fact that the chambers don't look, talk, or think like the vast majority of Americans. They don't mirror the population. They often engage in short-term thinking. They make decisions based on what's going to, get me through this
election cycle or funding. Yeah,
exactly. They don't deliberate, as I said. They just do this kind of hostage negotiation. They often put agenda items, items on the agenda that are not really thought through. What gets on the docket is often a function of what's the media talking about right now, what's current in the conversation. But there could be a lot of social problems out there that aren't being put in the media spotlight, but they don't go unaddressed because they're not known about, or they're not hot button and kind of sexy. And then again, more corruption within the chamber. You've got people, lobbyists descend on the chambers, they buy off politicians. And then again, a lot of these figures, too many, are these toxic personalities. So all of those pathologies run rampant through the system and kind of destroy this whatever idealized image we might have of kind of the best among us rising to the top, as meritocracy. In practice, it just doesn't work like that. So if you change this whole system, eliminate all these kind of pathologies of electoral representation, and take everyday people, bring them together in a kind of environment where they're set up to make good decisions, what would that take? Like a controlled situation, impartial information without, propaganda or motivated interests in the room, and then facilitated deliberation. That's going to set up people to actually, and they're going to know, oh, my decision will have real impact. then people will invest in that process. We see it in the jury system every week in America. I mean, would you want to elect jurors? I think people would have problems on that premise that they're going to be enlightened to make the best decisions. I think we would all instinctively reel at that. So if it's okay for the justice system, why not bring that model into the policy domains of legislatures? And the fact of the matter is that we don't have to have a theoretical discussion. We have now had over the last 20 years hundreds, if not over 1,000, citizens' assemblies around the world that have provided real evidence that this actually does work. If you set people up for success, you bring them together, a randomly selected group, you give them the expert information, and then they work with facilitators to find consensus. They produce outcomes that are more intelligent and are more widely accepted by the community. They have greater political legitimacy this way, and durability over the long haul. So these examples of assemblies are, including ones now in the U.S. on the local level, are showing that this model of jury democracy does actually work, and I think that's very positive, and we should have more and more of those going forward.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. So when someone, well, our first guest, our mutual friend Phil Lindsay, from Hannah Arendt Center, also works in citizen assemblies. So, but if this is the first time tuning in, maybe you can define what citizen assemblies are for our listeners. And a quick point I want to say before you do that is, like, I like how what you're saying is, like, people feel like, well, maybe why don't you define citizen assemblies first, and I'll make this point, because it'll be
Sure.
good context for our listeners. Yes.
Well, I think I defined it earlier, but it's basically a system, and it can go by different names. There's been some processes are called deliberative polls. Sometimes they're called civic assemblies. You'll hear different terminology, but citizens assembly is the one term that's kind of the field is kind of coalesced around. And it's a process of decision making, collective decision making. Usually what happens is there's a mandate. It's usually, the assembly is convened usually by some kind of government authority, and they have an issue they want to have decided upon. So the convening authority calls for the assembly, and it goes through these three phases I mentioned. The first is a process of random selection of residents in the community to create a representative sample of the population in this group. And the final numbers could range from, sometimes 15 or 20 or 30 to 100 or more, 150. You want enough, it depends on how many people you're trying to represent here in the populace. So the random selection of the delegates, they come together, again, they learn from a panel of experts, a wide spectrum of experts on this particular issue, as well as stakeholders and so forth. And then the third phase is the deliberations towards consensus. They produce their recommendations, and those get handed off back to the government, the convening authority for some kind of response. Most assemblies around the world have been advisory to date. They make recommendations that the government can then decide what to do with. But there's a growing empowerment of such assemblies in different countries. So Ireland's actually gone through a number of cycles of using assemblies on a national level, combined with referendums, to make real sizable political change. They've amended their constitution in several key ways through a combination of assemblies and referenda. The most notable ones include getting same-sex marriage legalized and repealing the ban on abortion that was in the Irish Constitution. That all happened through a citizens' assembly process, again combined with a referendum. France has held national citizen assemblies over the past few years on topics like climate change and end of life. Again, those were advisory, but they did it at scale for a nation of tens of millions of people. Belgium is a pioneer in assemblies, and actually one province of Belgium has created a new hybrid system of government using a permanent citizens' assembly working alongside the elected chamber. And the city of Paris has done that as well. Canada has had many assemblies on the local and provincial level, even the national. So it's really, people talk about a deliberative wave over the last 20 years that swept the Western world. Australia's had many, Japan. But those are, I would say, the three key pillars again: the sortition, learning, and deliberation.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that again. And it's exciting to hear there seems to be a emerging movement, not just here in the U.S., but around the world. Because how I kind of think of this movement that you're a part of and that I'm sticking my neck in with Undetermined States of America is that, well, yeah, if I could, I'm going to plug the podcast, I guess, for a bit. But the whole premise of the Undetermined States of America is that we no longer feel united because we don't actually believe that our government fulfills our vision anymore. It doesn't. It no longer lives up to what we celebrate on 4th of July, which is the Declaration of Independence and a government by and for the people. We've kind of lost the plot, and we don't. Yeah, that's one reason I think we're experiencing so much discord. Is like, yes, we have infighting and political parties, and we're polarized and all of that, but I think we just don't have a unified vision for what we want our government to look like. And I'm
Which makes
imagining
sense.
that.
I mean, that makes sense
Go ahead.
when you think of the diversity of this massive country, 350 million people. Of course, we're not going to have a unified vision. I mean, the motto of the country is "E pluribus unum." Out of many comes one. But the key word there is, like, I think the beginning out of this, many people coming together have to produce this unified vision, and that begs the question: does our political system incentivize this to occur? I would say no. It incentivizes the opposite, because the whole system is based on, again, on this, fundamentally based on warfare and conflict. You build up opposing parties that are locked in. I mean, we use the language of war in the political process, right? Your campaigns, your field operations. And then the system is, especially in the U.S., it's winner take all, loser gets nothing, not proportional, or no power sharing arrangements. So if you have a system where it's a very diverse continent, you have strong regional cultures, like Colin Woodard's work on American Nations shows that maybe 10 or 12 different sub regions of the country with very diametrically opposed cultural worldviews. You're asking them to exist in a political system where if they lose an election, they could lose everything to their, the polar opposite worldview, and that opposing side can impose their vision on the rest without any reason to compromise, plus all the other bad incentives in the system. That's not a recipe for getting a fractious, diverse group of people to come to a unified vision. So again, what would be a better way to do that? A more sane, rational way would be to have a system set up to encourage people to bring out, again, encourage the pro-social tendencies we do actually have as human beings, and to get people to come together and as equals without all the bad incentives that are in the system, the profit motives and everything, to actually forge a shared common life and common vision. And I would say that a deliberative democratic model like the one I've described would be much better, more adept at producing that.
Yeah, I obviously agree. And it's
Colin,
kind
can
of,
I? Sorry, I have to
yeah,
interrupt.
no problem.
Because I moved. My battery is now not plugged in. Can I just grab?
All right. What were we saying? I forgot where we were. I should know this is the host. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's if we start thinking about our democracy, our government, as something that needs to be molded or evolve. Like, we kind of just see it as this static thing that, well, that's just how it is, and we just got to vote in better people or that are more aligned. But I think what's unique about the American project is that I think it's supposed to be more evolutionary. And I've said in the Undetermined States of America, like, opener, that we're running Windows 1776. Like, it's an old technology that 250 years ago was creme de la creme. It was like the shit. Like, oh, well, I mean, it was better than what maybe like the monarchy and other forms. Obviously, it was limited to only usually land-owning white males and participating. And we've come a long way to obviously increase the participation in this system. But the idea is that the fundamental design of it is not compatible with the kind of e pluribus unum vision of figuring out what the common good might look like. Like, even if we have a more state-based nation where the different regions could have their own kind of like laws, we could still imagine there being a unifying, the United States, dare I say, that are unified in around a better technology and process for increasing the likelihood of a common good vision, more defined by and for the locality of where the people live. And I just think it's really exciting to like the kind of I think it's part of what our identity or not ethnic identity rather, but like our national identity is, that we're meant to be pioneers and visionaries of democracy. And I don't know what else we need, other signs we need for it. It's time to do that again. Like, it might be time. Like, I think 86% of people across the political spectrum, across the political party spectrum, agree our elections are kind of overly influenced by money and special interest, and there's a real common ground there I'm hoping to tap into, and I think Assemble America is tapping into. So, well, I do want to give you space to share what Assemble America, your nonprofit, is all about, and would you like to take the mic?
Absolutely. I should get to what are we trying to do then?
What are you doing over there?
So what Assemble America is trying to do, I mentioned I got involved in this deliberative democracy space about 8 years ago or so. And what I noticed from the beginning was that we had a bunch of amazing scholars writing about democracy by assembly, as I call it. We had some practitioner organizations that run assemblies. The most notable one is Healthy Democracy. I'll plug them. They're in Portland, Oregon. Great folks there who've run a lot of the assemblies here in the U.S., but other practitioner groups in other countries. What the field didn't have, though, was a political organizing vehicle, a movement behind this. I discovered that this was, this was a vision, an amazing vision of democracy, but it had no movement to it, the way other reforms do, like ranked choice voting or something like that.
Movement meaning like boots on the ground, political activism, or community organizing.
Yes, trying to put this reform on the ballot, trying to get it passed into law, put it into the political system through organizing of activists. And so it's been a long process, but that's what Assemble America is designed to be for the field and for the country, is to take this keystone change of citizens' assemblies, democracy by assembly, and organize everyday Americans to advocate for bringing this into the political system. Because, as you put it, we're supposed to be the pioneers and innovators of democracy. In 1786, we were, and the whole culture was advancing rapidly beyond the old world of Europe in many areas of life. But though we've made some massive updates at different times, like the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, and then again in the New Deal era, some big democratic waves, we have not done any real updating in over 50 years, and we've fallen behind other countries. We can no longer say we are the leaders in democracy. I mentioned all these other countries using citizens' assemblies. They're kind of way ahead of us at this point, and experimenting with these other forms of democracy. And so we really have a lot to learn from other countries now. And if we're gonna, which takes some humility to think, and I think that's one of the problems we have right now, which we can get into some of the challenges what we're facing. But Assemble America is trying to build a political movement now, championing this form of democracy through two paths: a political, legal path, and a movement building path. What we want to try to create is reform of institutions to bring about deliberative democracy into the existing structures of government, while also building a movement of people who, on a parallel track, are going to engage in direct action and other processes, other tactics to both compel the adoption of democracy by assembly into the current structures, but also, be prepared to build new parallel institutions with this new form of democracy alongside the existing one, kind of the building the new society within the shell of the old, to borrow a quote from Dorothy Day, one of my heroes. So that's what we're about in a general sense. What does that mean specifically? Our goal is kind of twofold. We want to see permanent empowered citizens' assemblies in state government with authority, real power over some aspect, it could be limited at first, of state governance. So again, not just ad hoc assemblies that are merely advisories, but permanent ones with real decision-making power. Have these in state government. And then we're also calling for a People's Constitutional Convention, a jury convention that will reform the proposed amendments to the federal Constitution through citizens' assembly deliberative process. And so those are our twin goals: state level permanent bodies, and then constitutional reform, constitutional revision through citizens' assemblies. And we have more detailed strategies for each of those, how to achieve that, what we envision. But those are our outcomes. We want to see this by 2030. Within 5 years, we'd like to see many states with these permanent assemblies, and then this constitutional convention, a people's jury convention, by 2030.
Hell yeah. Yeah, that's really exciting, and I'm really inspired by your mission, and not just the mission, but the clarity and the precision of the strategy you've laid out on your website. Is it assembleamerica.org for people to...
That's right.
Know where to go? Yeah, and so this two-prong goals of a state-level permanent citizen assembly bodies and a constitutional revision by a kind of jury-led people's assembly. Would you see those two things happening in parallel, and in a 5-year timeline, which I am super down for? Does it sound ambitious? Yes, but America was an ambitious idea when it started. Yeah, do you see those two things happening in parallel? And maybe you can give a little texture to what the strategies would be for each of those on their own?
Certainly. So the core strategy is to build chapters of activists at every state, starting at the local level with pods that then feed into bigger state-based chapters. And the idea is that these activists would work in the political landscape of their state with the particular laws of their state to find the way to institute legally, perhaps through constitutional change or a referendum, a ballot measure, perhaps act of the legislature, again, this permanent body of citizens picked by lottery that would have power over something in the state. It could be, again, very limited, mandated initially. It could be citizens assembly that itself writes future ballot measures for the referendum to make that process more rational and intelligent, and that would combine deliberative democracy with participatory democracy, the assembly with referenda. It could be it has the power to rewrite the redistricting process in the state could be done through this citizens assembly. Actually, this is already happening in Michigan. Michigan has its redistricting process. Its commission now is made up of, I believe it's 12 citizens of Michigan who are picked by lot to every 10 years draw the congressional districts, which is very exciting. So it could be that. It could be a policy domain. That's less relevant initially, but you want to have real power. The idea being that this is a wedge. It's kind of the wedge theory of change. If you get this body of people in the door, you get your foot in the door here. It's kind of like a hack of the system, a beachhead into which you can then expand and grow the power of that body, or perhaps create additional bodies down the road to peel off topics away from the elected legislatures and put more and more of that onto these sortition bodies. So that's the idea through these state-based movements. And then
I could jump in quick before you share the constitutional piece. I really like that strategy and the metaphor of the wedge. There's this idea, I might have mentioned in the last episode, of like interstitial revolution by this sociologist Eric Olin Wright from Wisconsin-Madison. I think he passed away, unfortunately, but
yes,
cancer, yes, and I think in 2017. But he wrote this great book that I've read a solid chunk of called Envision Real Utopias, and he describes revolution and the kind of kinetics of revolution. And when we think of revolutionary change, he's like, we usually think of one group in power overtaking another group in power, but he's like, that's only one form of revolution. He defines that, or calls that ruptural revolution. Then another form of revolution or change, I like the word evolution more because it sounds less violent, but is interstitial revolution, where you build out more egalitarian, more fluid institutions in the interstices or cracks of the currently existing system, and then because of their nature of being more flowy and egalitarian and hopefully better technologically speaking, and the kinetics of the decisions being made, those egalitarian institutions eventually outgrow the obsolete system. It's like, yeah, building the new in the shell of the old, and to use the evolutionary language of like outgrowing it. So I really like this idea, Nick, of state-level permanent bodies, like trying to get the wedge in. It's exciting to hear that it's already sounding like it's beginning to happen in Michigan. Because, yeah, it's a really... I don't know. I love that framing of interstitial revolution because, like, I can see it kind of happen. Like, you plant these seeds of citizens' assemblies, and it kind of helps create a cultural shift. And, oh, my gosh, this is actually happening and possible. So I just wanted to give that little interjection there.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, Eric Olin Wright was a big proponent of citizens' assemblies. Actually, another volume in that same series, Real Utopias, is called Legislature by Lot, which he edited with, I believe, John Gastile, scholar at Penn State. And all the essays in that volume are pushing sortition democracy. So he's a great person to cite at this time.
That's awesome. I didn't know I got to look at his oeuvre more in detail. That's awesome. I know he wrote about that.
I think that was one of the last things he helped publish. Yeah, and that's right. I mean, another phrase that gets this idea is the idea of a non-reformist reform, a kind of something you introduce as a reform into an existing system, but it actually doesn't just ameliorate the current system, actually unlocks a whole new paradigm, a whole new space for changing the system, almost like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, if we want to go into the natural metaphor. It's like it came from the old, but you know, it it's something again, like almost like again the idea of a hack, something. Yeah, this thing you introduce into the system that actually unlocks a whole new transformative change. And people, yeah, 5 year time frame could seem like really short, and there are other democracy advocates out there who have a longer horizon, but we think that's the right amount of time that takes seriously the crisis we're in, which we don't have the luxury of waiting too long, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and but also not being totally unrealistic and thinking like we're going to be able to achieve this next year, and and again though this is like actually the minimum we want to see because this is like sort of phase one would be these state assemblies and then some constitutional revision via a citizens assembly process. But I don't think it should end there, and we can get into kind of the ultimate goal. But yeah, something like a non-reformist reform, the idea of getting the thin edge of the wedge in first to get people seeing that this works, and then you can drive home the rest of the wedge later.
Using your wedge iron.
Yes,
Sorry.
exactly.
The driver wedge.
That's right.
Just don't hit the caterpillar on the tree because it's metamorphosized.
Right. We're mixing our
I
metaphors.
hope everyone's following our metaphors here. So yeah, do you want to share what the big jackpot vision is, which I'm assuming is a constitutional convention? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that what you were alluding to with the grander vision?
Well, I think even yes, and even beyond that, the field is sort of you have different people with different visions of how we should use sortition democracy. Some people see citizens assemblies as helpful tools or processes that could help improve the current system, help politicians make better decisions. So kind of again this incrementalist approach, or a kind of a tool to get better information. The more conservative vision, I'm of the view, along with others, of the more radical vision. I ascribe to the vision of a system that has moved beyond an electoral system and party system entirely, and to move into a new, full-blown system of government governed by probably multiple bodies of people based on sortition, rotation, deliberation. So a whole new system of government, which I would argue is actual democracy. So a true democratic regime where we have left behind the old. Not entirely, perhaps. We still have, just as we still have elements in some countries of monarchy, like the British have a figurehead monarch still, but they've really moved beyond monarchy. You can still have envision a future where we maybe still have elections and even politicians, but they are figureheads, or their power has been really diminished, and the lion's share of power has been given over to a democratic system, which is actually what happened in Athens. I should add, to go back to that, the Athenians never totally abolished the Areopagus, the aristocratic council that had ruled before the democracy. It continued on, but over time they stripped more and more power away from it to the point where it had very limited function, and so that could happen. You can imagine that happening with this. But I think, unlike the example of monarchy and parliament, we have to have this evolution happen, I think, much faster. Parliament took centuries to come into its power. I think we don't have the luxury of waiting that long, and so this, I think we're talking hopefully a few decades, not centuries.
Yeah, and I agree, especially with like climate change and the threat of nuclear war, and just the economy there's polycrises, so many things happening. Not to be a buzzkill, and I was watching my YouTube algorithm recently suggested Rick Steves' Iran, went to Iran to visit it. It was like from 2009. And he was talking to some Iranians, and they were like, "Yeah, like our government hates the U.S. and wants to fight, but the people don't really. They're not really about that." And I think, well, basically, I don't know why I told you the Rick Steves YouTube thing, but just yeah, that's
Well,
great.
I
You
bet
could have
that
made the point without that.
I actually posted this on social media the other day. I say I bet if you took an everyday, a citizens' assembly of everyday Americans picked by lottery and had them come together and ask them to, get their view, have them make the decision about what to do about Iran. I mean, I can't speak obviously with 100% certainty, but I'm pretty sure they would not decide to bomb them, at least not right now. And likewise, I think
Yeah,
if you talk about global governance, I think if you imagine the United Nations totally reformed through this kind of process, where people the globe over are coming together, everyday people, I think you would see a lot of the world's problems resolved probably more peacefully. Don't want to be complete utopian Pollyannish here, but I I would gather that a lot of the conflicts of the world would be handled differently with
evaporate overnight.
less violence. Not that the
I
conflicts will go
agree.
away, but that they'll just be managed better and dealt with. Because conflict is a part of life. Deliberative democracy is not about eliminating conflict, which is actually a charge leveled against it sometimes. People say, "Oh, politics is about conflict, and there's just you can't have a conflict-free system." And it's like, no. It's not about eliminating conflict. It's about having people again set up to resolve conflict in a healthier way. And that, the example of foreign policy to go back to earlier. I mean, Americans have almost zero influence over what our government does abroad. I mean, talk about anti-democratic. We are never, elections almost never turn on foreign policy questions. Rarely, sometimes, like in a state of war, like maybe 2008, it was kind of a referendum on the Iraq War, and you could say in maybe the 70s, 60s, maybe Vietnam was really on the ballot, but those are the exceptions. And yet the governments have almost unchecked massive power to abroad in foreign affairs, which we have almost no control over. So it's another is a brief for this in a different system.
Yeah, well, a lot of the crises facing our world require cooperation. It's like they just require government entities to cooperate, and yeah, most political systems are built on a view of human nature that is based on competition. And while that might have its kind of efficiency, like pros, like is like advantages to competition because everyone kind of knows what war is, and it's like, okay, this might result in the best outcome. It's like competition is no longer up to the task of what the current problems are. So I see cooperation as the main order of the day for not just national but global problems. And this is not a unique thought that I have. Like, wow, get this guy on stage. Yeah. But yeah, our systems are based on a more Hobbesian dog eat dog world or dog eat dog view of human nature than it's not tapping into the better angels of our nature, which we are naturally cooperative, and that's been shown to like evolutionary anthropology and history. Now, there's not war, obviously, but humans are usually predisposed to cooperate. Um,
Which is
so
why
yeah,
sometimes anarchists, they'll point that out and say this is why we shouldn't have a state at all. But I would push back and say the state as a institution is probably inevitable, again, because of human nature. And actually the book to read on this is called The State by Philip Pettit, who's a scholar at Princeton, who makes a very convincing case to me that the state is kind of an inevitable outcome of
yeah.
people trying to coordinate their activities and create conventions and norms and so forth for for common coexistence, it's going to lead to something like the state. So the question is, well, how do you make sure that that state does not become this, Leviathan that is detached and becomes all of a sudden now an entity unto its own that's not controlled by people, that is, tyrannizing them or doing unjust things in various ways. And I would say that the Athenians kind of found the hack. They through sortition, rotation, the use of the courts, all these other strict accountability measures. They had a lot of fascinating accountability measures, because people often ask that, well, how do you have accountability if there's not elections? And again, elections themselves aren't a feature that brings about accountability. But the Athenians had a bunch of other accountability features, like scrutiny of office holders every year. Again, these political trials that could remove people for corruption or unconstitutional acts. And then ostracism, kind of my favorite. The Athenians had this system where every year they could choose to banish one person from the polis for a decade. It was exile, basically, and it was not done often in the course of their history. I think about 15 times, from what I've gathered, was it ever actually used. But it sort of had a deterrent effect against would-be demagogues and tyrants and elites who wanted to come back to power, because they knew if they started to corrupt the system, they could be banished entirely. So maybe something to think about bringing back for for us. I don't know, but
it's called cancel culture, Nick.
Ah, yes, right. Maybe not done in quite the same way,
Yeah.
but
Exile will probably be preferable, a little more humane, perhaps. Yeah. Well, do you mind sharing I do want to be mindful of time. I think we're going to have a part 2. But before we go, would you mind sharing a high-level overview of the constitutional revision process that is part of Assemble America's strategy for change?
yes. So this strategy actually comes from Larry Lessig of Harvard, Harvard Law, and
Personal hero of mine. I like him a lot.
yes, and he's
Yeah.
on our advisory board, and can't speak more highly of
Awesome.
Lessig. Uh, for context, people may be aware that for the past couple of decades, there's been a movement among associated with the far right. I would say the anti-democratic movement to trigger a Article 5 constitutional convention. That is a convention of the states. The Constitution provides 2 ways to amend itself. One is more familiar to us, where the Congress ratifies amendments, and then Congress proposes amendments, passes them in each chamber with a 2/3 majority, and then they get ratified by the 3/4 of the state legislatures or special conventions in the states. And all the amendments we have been passed that way. But there's Article 5 provides this other avenue for revision, a convention of states. So in this path, if 3/4 of the state legislatures petition Congress as pass resolutions calling for a convention, it gets automatically triggered, and then those states send delegates to the convention to propose and deliberate upon and try to agree upon amendments. And then those have to be ratified in turn. I'm sorry, 2/3 of the state legislatures have to pass those resolutions calling for convention, and then 3/4 again have to ratify any proposed. So it's a way the states can do constitutional change without Congress. So this movement has been underfoot. It's a couple of different groups. The most notable is called the Convention of States movement to trigger this Article 5 process. Now, they have a particular agenda, which I would argue is an elite-driven agenda to ostensibly bring about fiscal integrity, as they would call it, to the Constitution, things like a balanced budget amendment and other things. But it's really, I think, it would be cementing the kind of anti-government approach of like Project 2025 and Doge and these kinds of things we're seeing right now. Kind of cement that into constitutional language. So today, people who are not in favor of this, the more pro-democracy groups out there, their response has been, let's just hope and pray this doesn't happen. uh, because as anti-democratic as the Constitution may be right now, to have a convention could open up a Pandora's box of evils that could make things even worse if these groups have their way at such a convention. So they've basically had no response, no real strategic counter proposal or counter movement. So Lessig argued in an essay a couple years ago, the New York Review of Books, that this is foolish. This movement has come pretty close, actually, to accomplishing their goal of triggering this convention. They're only a few states away. And it's really high time to have a counter strategy, a more pro-democratic approach that could ensure that such a convention, if called, would be democratic in nature. And so what he calls for is at least 13 states, but hopefully more, to pass legislation creating citizens' assemblies that would propose amendments to that convention. So we'd have assemblies that would do constitutional revision in each state. And then, if a convention is called, the delegates to that convention could be bound legally to enact the amendments proposed by the citizens' assembly of their state, and only those proposed amendments. In other words, if they get to the convention, they would not be free to endorse or okay any other amendments proposed at that convention that have not been proposed by their home state's citizens' assembly. And then you could also have a same kind of process for the ratification phase. You could the Constitution says again, amendments from this convention could have to be ratified either by the legislature or a special ratifying convention. You could also have those ratifying conventions be a deliberative democratic process of everyday people. And Lessig thinks if you have at least 13 states that put in place this identical legislation towards this effect, that's enough to thwart the ratification of any amendments. That's over 3/4 state of the states. And so if over 3/4 of the states have said up front, we will not ratify or even consider any amendments proposed by a convention of states that have not been proposed by our state citizens assembly, then the people at that convention are going to know in advance, okay, we're not going to be able to get railroad through our vision here because these states have already said, they're only endorsing amendments through this deliberative process. So it's an ingenious way to kind of both play defense against anti-democratic decisions that could come out of a convention, but even more so play offense, have a proactive new way to, have the people actually propose the amendments in a truly democratic fashion through these assemblies. So that's what our strategy entails for this People's Jury Convention. We want to have at least 13 states, hopefully more, pass legislation that would say that in the event of an Article 5, and they could even petition to have the convention as well. They could join the chorus for a convention, but say, yeah, let's have it, actually. Instead of wishing it doesn't happen, let's have it, but it's going to happen according to this deliberative democratic process.
Cool. That sounds like a really smart strategy. I like how you mentioned it's both defensive and preventing something from getting railroaded through, but also lays the groundwork for a citizen assembly informed constitutional convention. Yeah, when I heard of the two Article 5 ways to call a convention, like you mentioned, the first one being Congress starts the process for that, which seems like never happened, and then
Certainly not
doing
now.
it through this, yeah, and then the other option is through 2/3, I think you said, of the state legislators. And yeah, I've only done a little bit of like organizing and I guess technically lobbying for my work in the psychedelic field here in New York State, and it felt way more buy-in for the people. Not that there's not cronyism and all that at the state level, but it feels way more accessible than the federal government. And uh, I, re- uh, continuing along the metaphor of that we're running Windows 1776, then we need to envision what USA 2025 or 2030 looks like. I see these options in the Constitution as like they're the kind of reset buttons. Like it's baked into our Constitution that we are able to redesign the Constitution. It's a pretty high threshold to meet 2/3 of states, but there's hope for me in the fact that it's by the state legislators, because those seem a little more closer down to earth, I would say. Anyways, just wanted to say
Yes,
that.
I agree, and the ballot referendums, half the states have those, so that offers another path to passing all kinds of reform legislation, including something like this. But yeah, I agree, and actually we see this as the beginning. Assemble America, we think that then this could pave the way to, and we could bake this into the legislation, calling for, this would be the first constitutional convention in 200 and over 250 years. That is objectively not a lot of, that's like a long time to go without making major revisions. Most constitutions around the world are revised I think on average every like 20 years. But actually, Jefferson, to go back to the founding period, Jefferson thought that's what it should be. Every 20 years or so, each generation he thought should have the chance to make the government itself, because he thought the dead hand of the past cannot rule the living. But unfortunately, he again wasn't at the convention in '86, and the framers made our Constitution one of the most difficult to amend of any on earth. And then you combine that with all the political, again, struggles and conflicts in the population over the centuries, and it's made it very, very difficult. So we want to see this change. We would like to see, if we trigger a people's convention, have it be the first in maybe an ongoing kind of permanent process of constitutional revision. Perhaps every 10 years you could have a convention, or maybe even, just again envisioning down the road, some kind of permanent council of constitutional revision that's meeting on a slower timetable than the regular legislature, but that it itself would reserve questions of kind of this meta structural reforms of the system to itself, and have on a longer time frame. Because again, the world is complex, it's always changing, and it would make empirically kind of more sense to have it make adjustments as we go along. So we don't see this kind of as like a one and done kind of convention. Okay, we're great now for the next 250 years. No, let's have this be the first now in a new ongoing.
We did it.
Right.
Yeah.
And the two things would happen
Yeah.
if this occurred. I mean, you would get, on the one hand, actual amendments to the current Constitution would come about that would probably be certainly have a broader legitimacy coming from these assemblies. But then you'd also demonstrate to the public, the assemblies themselves, their deliberations and their work could be shown to the American people as kind of the secondary lesson of the whole thing. Like the first product would be the actual amendments to the existing system, but then people would also see sort of the secondary lesson learned. Oh, wait a minute, it came about through that deliberative process. Oh, that seemed to work really well. Maybe we should start to have more of that be in the whole system. So
I'm also really glad's not the right word, but seeing the synergy. I'm seeing the synergy between our lack of community and connection with each other and civic engagement and these deliberative democracies, that it can also help solve for the social ill of just loneliness and isolation. It's part of the Overton window now, I think, that we are not meeting enough people in general, especially other fellow citizens, fellow Americans. And so I'm hoping it's inspiring to Americans, not just because of the political legitimacy and outcomes being better, but also that this is something in my bones feels like very natural and right. And like, yeah, this is, and we're a very extroverted culture as well, I think, American culture. So I'm hoping that can be an additional cultural thrust to it being taken on favorably by fellow Americans.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's so much written about the isolation of American life now that's contributing to the breakdown of the political process. And people are bemoaning that, the collapse of civic associations, religious groups, etc. But, and we need to repair all of that. But you could actually see, if you imagine a system where you have these sorts of processes, multiple bodies of citizens at each level of government, national, regional, state, local, and meeting different lengths of time for different purposes, different tasks. I mean, you're talking about enlisting tens of thousands of people now into the political process, which would have all sorts of benefits, but also for the system in the country, but also for the people involved. You can see these bodies, these experiences being sites for themselves, community building, and coming together as a tonic for some of the difficulties of the struggles of late modern life. I mean, I served on the jury. I got called for jury duty a few years ago here in Boston, and after just a few days of this process, I mean, I think the other jurors, we came out of it feeling like really good. Just like as a person, I was like, oh wow, I feel some pride in my city. I connected with these people. It's such an intense experience. Afterwards, we all went out and got lunch together, and we're buying each other drinks. It was like, you bond so quickly and so powerfully in something like a jury process, and so you feel like you have a stake in the city. Like I'm actually connected to this city. It's a powerful emotional benefit, and studies. Research on delegates in citizens' assemblies around the world indicates that this is what happens to people who get picked for these processes. They come out feeling empowered, a sense of agency, civic pride. Many of them go back to their home, communities and get more involved in the political process than they ever were before. A large number gone on to run for office later, do other it really creates kind of a democratic muscle, and that's all kind of ancillary benefits that we didn't speak so much about the human kind of personal side of living in these different regimes. But I mean, the truth is that democracy is the only system of government that really allows us to be fully human, because we're born with all these capacities for cooperation, rational thinking, collective decision making. And only in a system that allows for that can you exercise fully your humanity. So I'm going to get another rejoinder to anyone who thinks that we would be better off with some benevolent CEO, running everything, or technocracy of the most brilliant. It's like, well, none of that will allow the vast majority of people to become fully human and live and exercise, grow, develop the most to the highest level that nature has endowed us with. So only democracy can make us truly happy, I will say, and as well as being the best way to coordinate complex problems and deliver the best and most efficient outcomes. There's no trade-off, contrary to what people like Curtis Yarvin and others are saying. There's no trade-off between democracy and efficient, complex problem solving. It's actually the opposite. Democracy is the best way to do that and to make people feel good about their lives.
Amen. I totally agree. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me here today, Nick, on episode 2 of Undetermined States of America. It's a really inspiring vision and mission you have with Assemble America. And yeah, our model at Undetermined States of America is to be determined by and for the people. And Assemble America seems, in my opinion, one of the best equipped vehicles for bringing that about. So I will link your website in the chat in the description. Is there any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I was going to say yes. We're to all your listeners. People want to visit our website, join us, sign up. We need your help, and we are trying to build a movement. And so we welcome everyone to share this with others, to join us, and yeah, let's try to make this happen. It will take a real movement. We didn't talk about the challenges we face. There are many in the culture and in the political system, of course, but we have hope that we can make this change, and so I thank you for giving me a platform to speak about it, and hopefully the word gets spread.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Also, we will be participating in a live event in New York City on July 19th with Nick and my previous podcast guest, Phil, at the Francis Kite Club in East Village on July 19th. And those details will also be shared on the podcast description and on the Substack. So I will see you in a few weeks in person. And thanks again for joining us, Nick. I really appreciate you coming on.
Hey, thanks, Colin. This was a real pleasure.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.